Hello everyone, have a great day. Today,
I'll continue the story of Jack and Single Life.
follow more heartwarming love stories.
Jack had never been good with children. In his world, children appeared in photographs on desks, in annual reports about family-friendly culture, or in brief, polite conversations at charity events. They were distant, well-behaved, and always handed back to their parents after a few seconds of careful smiling. He had never held one. Not really. Not long enough to feel anything. But that afternoon in the quiet mountain village changed everything. It happened without warning. Single Life was outside the house, hanging clothes to dry under the pale sunlight. The wind moved gently across the yard, carrying the smell of soap and damp fabric. Inside, Bé Tôm was playing on the floor with his wooden car, pushing it along the ground, making soft engine sounds. Jack stood nearby, repairing a loose piece of the fence. It was a simple task, something his hands had grown used to in this place. Wood, nails, small problems that could be fixed without meetings or contracts. Then a sudden sound broke the quiet, a sharp cry. Bé Tôm. Jack turned immediately. The boy had tripped on the uneven wooden step near the doorway. He sat on the ground, stunned for a second, then his face crumpled as the pain reached him. He started to cry. Not loudly, but enough. Single Life was still outside, her back turned, unaware. Jack hesitated for half a second, just half. Then he moved. He stepped inside quickly and crouched down in front of the child. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, his voice gentler than he had ever heard it before. Bé Tôm looked up, eyes wet, lips trembling. "Uncle Jack, it hurts." The word didn't register this time, only the pain did. Jack reached out, then paused. He had never done this before, never picked up a child, never held someone this small, this fragile, but the boy's eyes were on him, trusting, waiting. So Jack did the only thing he could. He lifted him, carefully. Awkwardly at first, one hand under the boy's back, the other supporting him as he rose. Bé Tôm wrapped his small arms instinctively around Jack's neck, and in that moment, something changed. Jack felt it immediately. The weight of the child wasn't heavy, but it was real, warm, alive. The boy's heartbeat was fast against his chest, small breaths uneven from crying. And suddenly, Jack's own heartbeat shifted. Stronger, louder, different. "It's okay," Jack whispered again, this time more naturally, his hand moving gently over the boy's back in a slow, calming motion. Bé Tôm's crying softened, then slowed, then stopped. His small fingers tightened slightly against Jack's shirt, as if holding on to something safe. Single Life heard the silence and turned around. She stepped inside and froze. Jack was standing there, holding her child, not awkwardly anymore, not like a stranger, but like someone who belonged there. Bé Tôm rested quietly against his shoulder, his face half hidden, calm again. Single Life's breath caught. For a second, she didn't move, because there was something in that picture, something she hadn't expected to see. Jack looked up when he sensed her. "He slipped," he said softly. "He's okay." Single Life nodded, but her eyes didn't leave them. Didn't leave the way Jack held the boy, didn't leave the way Bé Tôm held on to him. There was no distance between them, no hesitation, no fear, only something else, something warm, something that looked too much like family. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jack gave a small nod, but he didn't hand the child back immediately, because Bé Tôm hadn't let go. "Uncle Jack," the boy murmured softly, his voice already sleepy from the comfort. "Don't put me down yet." Jack felt it again, that strange pull in his chest. He glanced at Single Life, unsure. She hesitated for a moment, then gave a small, silent nod. So Jack stayed where he was, holding him, feeling the small weight settle naturally against him, feeling the rhythm of another life against his own, and for the first time, it didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt right. That evening, something had changed. The way Bé Tôm followed Jack around the yard, the way he reached for his hand without thinking. the way Jack instinctively slowed his steps so the child could keep up. Even during dinner, Bé Tôm chose to sit closer to Jack than usual, his small bowl in his hands, glancing up from time to time with a quiet smile. "Uncle Jack, will you eat with us tomorrow too?" he asked. Jack looked at him, at the open, hopeful face, at the expectation that had formed so quickly. "I will," he said, and he meant it. Single Life watched them both. Her heart was unsettled, because this was how it started. This was how attachments formed, not with promises, not with big words, but with small, quiet moments, with trust, with presence, with the feeling of safety. And she had learned, painfully, what happened when that safety disappeared. That night, after Bé Tôm fell asleep, she stood outside the house, watching the mountains fade into darkness. Jack stepped out to leave. "Jack," she called softly. He stopped. "You shouldn't hold him like that too often," she said. Jack frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because he'll get used to it." "And that's a bad thing?" he asked. Single Life's eyes didn't meet his. "Yes." The answer came too quickly, too sharply. Jack felt it. "You're afraid he'll depend on me," he said quietly. Single Life's fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden post beside her. "I'm afraid he'll be hurt," she replied. Jack stepped closer. "And you think I'll hurt him?" "No," she said immediately, then softer. "I think you'll leave." The words settled between them, heavy, honest, painful. Jack didn't look away, because for the first time, he didn't know if she was wrong. That night, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could still feel it, the small weight in his arms, the warmth, the trust, the way Bé Tôm had held on to him without fear, and something inside him, something he had kept locked away for years, had opened. Just a little. Enough to let something in, something dangerous, something that made leaving suddenly feel like loss. Jack closed his eyes slowly, and for the first time in his life, the idea of staying felt stronger than the habit of leaving. Across the dark village road, in a place far removed from the quiet mountains, a phone screen lit up in the night. A name appeared, a location, coordinates, a photograph. Jack, standing in a small wooden yard, holding a child. The woman staring at the screen narrowed her eyes. Her fingers tightened. "Found you," she whispered. Back in the village, Jack finally fell asleep, not knowing that the moment he held that child was the moment everything in his life had begun to change. The morning came quietly, too quietly. The village woke slowly, as it always did, the sound of chickens, distant voices, the soft rhythm of daily life returning to its place. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Jack stood in the yard, fixing a loose nail in the fence, the memory of yesterday still lingering in his chest, the weight of Bé Tôm in his arms, the small voice that had said, "Don't put me down yet." He hadn't expected that one moment to stay with him this long, but it did. It stayed in his hands, in his heartbeat, in the way he now looked at the small wooden house across from him, not as a place he visited, but as somewhere that felt close. Too close. Behind him, the door opened. Bé Tôm ran out barefoot, still holding the small wooden car Jack had fixed for him days ago. "Uncle Jack!" he called happily. Jack turned. The boy ran straight into him without hesitation, wrapping his arms around Jack's waist. Jack instinctively rested his hand on the child's head, a natural movement, effortless, as if he had done it 100 times before. "Did you sleep well?" Jack asked softly. "Yes," Bé Tôm nodded quickly. "Mom said I didn't cry at all last night." Jack smiled faintly. "Good," he said. Then, almost without thinking, he bent slightly and lifted the boy again. This time, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, only familiarity. Bé Tôm laughed, holding on to him with ease, like it was where he belonged. From the doorway, Single Life watched them. Her chest tightened, because this quiet, gentle closeness was exactly what she had been afraid of. Not because it was bad, but because it was real, and real things could break. The sound of an engine shattered the moment. Low, smooth, out of place. Jack's body went still before his mind caught up. Single Life turned toward the road. Bé Tôm stopped laughing. The black car appeared at the end of the path, shiny, polished, unfamiliar, and very, very real. It rolled slowly forward until it stopped in front of the house. Dust settled around its tires. The door opened. Jack didn't need to see her face to know who it was. His grip around Bé Tôm tightened instinctively, and for the first time, he didn't want to put the child down. The woman stepped out, elegant, controlled, impeccable in a world that had no place for such perfection. Jack's mother. Her eyes scanned the yard once, then stopped. On him, on the child in his arms, on the woman standing behind them. Something in her gaze changed. Not surprise, recognition, assessment, judgment. Jack. His name sounded different in her voice, sharper, heavier, like it carried the weight of everything he had tried to leave behind. Bé Tôm looked up at him, confused. "Uncle Jack, who is that?" he whispered. Jack didn't answer immediately, because he knew. The moment he did, nothing would be the same again. Single Life stepped forward slowly, placing herself a little closer to Jack and her son, not touching them, but near enough. A silent line. Jack's mother noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes moved to Single Life, then to Bé Tôm, then back to Jack. "I see you've been busy," she said calmly. Jack's jaw tightened. "I told you I needed time," he replied. "And I gave it to you," she said, "but I did not expect to find you here." Her gaze flicked again to the child in his arms. "And certainly not like this." Jack felt Bé Tôm's small hand tighten around his shirt. A reflex, a child's instinct when something felt wrong. And without thinking, Jack's arm tightened slightly in return. Protective, immediate, unmistakable. His mother saw it, and something cold flickered in her eyes. "Put the child down," she said. The words were not loud, but they were absolute. Jack didn't move. The air grew heavier. Single Life's fingers curled slightly at her sides. Bé Tôm pressed his face into Jack's shoulder. "Uncle Jack," he whispered. The word echoed again. Soft, trusting, dangerous. Jack lifted his gaze and met his mother's eyes. "No," he said quietly. It was the first time in a long time he had refused her directly. Silence fell, thick, heavy, unavoidable. His mother took a step forward. "You're forgetting who you are," she said. Jack shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I think I'm finally remembering." The words landed harder than anything else he could have said, because they were true, too true. Single Life's breath caught slightly. She hadn't expected him to say that. Not like this. Not in front of her. Not in front of the woman who clearly controlled his world. Jack finally lowered Bé Tôm gently to the ground, but his hand remained on the child's shoulder. A quiet promise, a silent protection. His mother watched the gesture, and now she understood. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't curiosity. This was attachment, and attachment could be used. Her voice softened slightly, but the coldness beneath it remained. "Jack," she said, "come back with me. We will discuss this properly, away from here." Jack didn't look away. "I'm not leaving them," he said. The words slipped out naturally. Them. Not them as strangers. Them as something he belonged to. His mother's expression hardened. "You are not part of this life," she said, "and they are not part of yours." Jack felt something rise in his chest again. The same feeling he had felt the first time he held the child. The same instinct. The same pull. "You're wrong," he said quietly. Bé Tôm looked up at him. "Uncle Jack, are you going somewhere?" he asked, his voice small. Jack's gaze softened immediately. "No," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "I'm right here." The child nodded, reassured, but his mother saw everything in that moment. The softness, the protection, the change, and she understood something clearly. Her son, the man she had shaped, trained, controlled, was no longer standing entirely on her side. She turned her gaze to single life, long, measured, unforgiving. "You should be careful," she said quietly. "Getting close to people whose lives you do not understand can be dangerous." The words were calm, but the meaning beneath them was sharp. A warning, a threat. Single life didn't look away. "I understand enough," she replied. The two women held each other's gaze, two completely different worlds, standing on the same ground. The wind picked up slightly. The sky above the mountains darkened just a little. Jack stood between them, between the life he had built and the life he had just begun to feel. And for the first time in his life, he knew this wasn't a decision he could delay. Because now, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the child who trusted him, the woman who feared being left, and the family that was about to take everything back. As the black car waited behind them, silent, patient, inevitable, Jack made a quiet decision in his heart. He didn't say it out loud, not yet, but it settled inside him with a weight that would not move. Because the first time he held that child, he didn't just feel something new. He felt something he could no longer walk away from.